In this video, I'd like to take you through the factors set out in the legislation that courts must consider when determining authorisation liability for copyright infringement in Australia. These factors are set out in sections 36 sub 1A and 101 sub 1A of the Copyright Act. These subsections were inserted by the Digital Agenda Amendments in the year 2000, and their purpose was to codify the principles set out by Justice Gibbs in the University of New South Wales and Morehouse decision, which I cover in an earlier video. So these provisions set out three factors that courts must consider when determining authorisation liability. The first is the intermediary, or the alleged authoriser's, power to prevent the acts of infringement. The second is the nature of the relationship between the authoriser and the primary infringers. And the third is what are the reasonable steps that the authoriser or intermediary could have taken to prevent or avoid the infringement. So these are the three factors which courts must consider. I'd like to now delve into these a little bit deeper and look at what they mean. So firstly, power to prevent. What does power to prevent mean? The short answer is that we don't really know. We don't really know how much control is needed to give an intermediary the power to prevent infringement. The High Court in the iiNet decision in 2012 told us that it must be more than a power to simply terminate a contractual relationship with an infringing user. So there must be more control than that is given by contract and the power to terminate a contract with the infringer. Beyond that though, we don't really know how much control is needed. There is also some confusion about how the first factor, the power to prevent, and the third factor, reasonable steps, interact, or how they relate to one another, because the way that the courts treat the factors in some cases indicates that there's quite a lot of overlap and that they impact on each other quite significantly. So I guess the question then is, will it always be a reasonable step to exercise a power to prevent? How much do these factors overlap? And to demonstrate the point I'm trying to make here, I'd like to refer to one of the cases in this area, Universal Music and Shaman. This was a 2005 decision. It involved the peer-to-peer file sharing software, had a mental blank, the peer-to-peer file sharing software Kazaa. So Shaman operated and maintained this software, made this software available on the internet. And a group of recording studios brought action against Shaman for authorising copyright infringement of their music because people were using Kazaa to share infringing portions, generally entire songs, from their repertoires. So they said that Shaman authorised infringement by making the software available and by maintaining the software. Now the court had to consider the three factors set out in section 101(1)(a). And what the court there did was, they looked at the fact that firstly, Kazaa had no central server. So the reality was that Shaman did not really have a power to prevent infringement because Kazaa had no central server through which Shaman could exercise control. So this was not like the earlier file sharing systems where there was a central server and users tapped into that central server and the intermediary came in on the other end and provided particular files. This was peer-to-peer file sharing in the sense of a swarm, and there was no central server through which all communications came and therefore which gave Shaman the ability to control those communications. So despite that fact, the court held that Charman did have a power to prevent infringement because they might have forced users to upgrade the version of the software they had, and the new version might have had a filter installed in the software which would either filter out infringing content through the use of metadata filters, or which might flood out infringing content by essentially flooding users' search results with files that contain only copyright warnings and not actual content files. And because Charman might have been able to install a filter in a new version of the software and force users to upgrade to the software, the court held that this gave them a power to prevent infringement. Exercising this power, as in using a filter, employing a filter, was also the reasonable step that Charman should have taken to try to prevent or avoid infringement. So in this case, power to prevent and reasonable step were one and the same thing. Now, I make this point mostly to demonstrate, firstly, that the concept of power to prevent is pretty fluid. Because we don't really know how much control is needed for a power to prevent, there's quite a lot of scope for courts to read in a power to prevent in order to catch bad actors, even when that power is not entirely clear, such as in the Charman decision. The second point is that what is a reasonable step will often depend on the extent of the intermediary's power to prevent. So those two factors bear on each other quite a lot. Now, what about the middle factor, the nature of the relationship? This factor tends to get skipped over a fair bit in the court cases, but where it does come up is that what the courts will often do is look at the nature of the relationship between the intermediaries and the users in the sense of whether it is a commercial relationship. So this came up both in the Charman case and in a case that was decided in the following year, in 2006, Cooper and Universal Music. And in both of those cases, the court held that because of the nature of the service provided and the fact that the intermediaries were deriving a financial benefit from the service, so generally this is through the use of advertising and the collection of advertising revenue, this converted the relationship that the defendants had with their primary infringers into a commercial relationship, and that this was significant under this second factor. So that is normally what courts will consider under the second factor.